Thank you so much, Rob, for those kind words, and thank you all very much for coming. You know, when the alumni office contacted me 6 months ago about coming to talk about the future of print journalism, I demurred. I told them I wasn't so sure I was going to have a job by June. Brooks Fail, who contacted me, thought I was kidding, but not really. So today, while I can still confidently call myself a regular contributor to the New York Times, the columnist label is a little bit shaky. And it all really reflects the condition of today's print newspaper business. So I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about what I do at the paper, and then we'll talk both about the New York Times in particular and about the newspaper industry in general. The second reason that I hesitated about speaking today is because Williams has any number of distinguished alumni in the journalism profession, and I'm pretty low on the totem pole. So as we get into the discussion, if anyone wants to bring their experience to bear, I will be grateful. On top of all that, speaking today reminds me of how old school the print medium really is. No, I have no PowerPoint display. There are no live video feeds today, no internet graphics. I basically brought along a bunch of paper. And this truly represents the past and not the future of journalism. So, the New York Times. As you can imagine, the Times has a huge hierarchical system. The last figure that I saw put the number of newsroom employees at 1,332, the largest in the history of the New York Times, and the highest number at any American newspaper. That said, that number does not reflect the latest rounds of buyouts and layoffs, but we'll get to that fun part later. For now, subtract at least 100 and figure that you can keep downsizing that number, so to speak, over the next few years. At the Times, the top of the heap in editorial is Bill Keller, the executive editor. Under Mr. Keller is the entire editorial board and the national op-ed columnists. There are also international, national, and metro news staffs, all part of the daily paper, all with their own section heads and deputies and copy staff. And the Times also has several weekly sections. There's Monday Sports, Tuesday Science Times, my personal favorite, Wednesday Dining In, Dining Out, because it's all about food, Thursday Homes, Friday Escapes, and there's several weekend sections. And while these special sections do have Times editorial staff, you would be surprised by how much of them are actually written by freelancers or contract writers. On Sundays, the Times also prints regional sections, and it's for these sections that I generally write, although not exclusively. These sections cover specific areas like Connecticut or New Jersey or Long Island or Westchester County. And I'm referred to either as a contract writer or a regular contributor, and that's because I'm on a regular schedule to produce stories. Also, for 8 years, I wrote a biweekly column covering the suburbs. But like hundreds of others who write for the paper, I'm not on staff and I'm not in the newspaper guild. So a lot of us contributors have been joking in a kind of gallows humor way that if only we were on staff, we could take the buyouts and then we could get paid not to write. But instead, we're watching what's going on in the newsroom and wondering how we're all going to be affected. In general, we're not feeling too optimistic. So, what's going on with print journalism? The news is discouraging. If I were writing the lead to this story, it would be something like, newspapers hemorrhage readership, advertisements, and market value. No easy solution in sight. There's some hard facts backing up this sense of doom. Newspaper circulation has been declining steadily since the 1980s, but the pace of that decline has picked up in recent years. Since 2003, circulation has been declining at a rate of roughly 2% a year. At the New York Times, in the 6-month period ending in March, circulation fell 3.9%. Ad revenue is also declining at an alarming rate. Adjusting for inflation, 2007 ad revenue was more than 20% below its peak in 2000. In April, the New York Times reported record losses for the quarter. Print advertising fell 10.6% that quarter at the paper, 10.6% in one quarter. So if a rate like that continues, you can imagine that the writing is on the wall for print to sustain itself. Now, how's all this affecting the value of newspapers? Badly, as you can well imagine. Independently, publicly traded American newspapers have lost 42% of their market value over the last 3 years. The once powerful Knight Ridder chain has collapsed under the pressure. It was sold to the McClatchy Company. Since making that purchase, the McClatchy Company has lost 80% of its own stock value. This may be a slightly old figure, but it's close. The New York Times Company's stock has declined by 54% since the end of 2004. And if it's old, it just means it's gotten slightly worse. So what caused all this collapse? Most of you can give me the easy answer. It's the Internet. Now, let me start by saying the Internet is a wonderful thing. And it's certainly, in many ways, the reporter's friend, offering endless research at his or her fingertips. And in many ways, the Internet really is the best medium for the delivery of journalism. You can use print, you can use pictures, videos, and sound. You've got unlimited space, which is a writer's dream, and you can converse with your readers. So this is really an amazing presentational tool, and it's a fabulous way of distributing information. But at present, at least in my opinion, it's no panacea for journalism. It's wonderful for advancing opinion, but so far I believe that while it's undermined the business of print newspapers, it hasn't really replaced it with much quality journalism of its own. But first let's look at how it's hurt newspapers. The number one assault has been on classified ads. The classified ad business has migrated almost completely to the Internet. Last year, my daughter Jeannie graduated from college. So it was time for her to look for work and for a place to live. I might add that she was a sociology and philosophy major, so I wasn't overly optimistic about how long this was going to take. So she came home from school and she blithely told me that she was going to take care of everything online. I decided it was time to gently tell her the facts of life and that she wasn't going to find either a job or an apartment on the Wild West of the Internet. So a few weeks later, she was settled into her new life, a job in Manhattan and an apartment in Brooklyn. She found the job on Monster.com, and she found the apartment on Craigslist. I recently heard Nick Lemon, the dean of Columbia Journalism School, speak. He described Craigslist's impact on newspapers as, quote, a torpedo hitting a ship in the most vulnerable spot. Classified ads supported some of the core work of the newsroom, paying in part for the work of political reporters, education writers, even the police beat. I'm not sure where the profits of Craigslist go, I presume to the owners of the company. But it isn't just the loss of ads you can attribute to the Internet. It's the loss of readers. This same daughter reads the New York Times every day, but she does not subscribe to the print version. She reads it online for free. The Times website is doing very well in terms of readers, but paradoxically, the free online version provides an incentive for readers to stop paying for the print version. And younger readers get their news online anyway. When my son was still in high school and he'd wander downstairs in the morning still sleepy, I would point out something in the paper or give him the latest sports score. And he would yawn and roll his eyes and say, "Mom, I knew that last night." Because, of course, he had been online. The most popular news site on the Internet right now is Yahoo News. But interestingly, Yahoo News has no news staff. Yahoo and Google are news aggregators. They collect the work done by journalists and they post it. Copyright law seems to have ceased to exist online, but that's another story for another time. The bottom line is that over the years, through these web search engines and through online newspapers themselves, journalism consumers have come to expect that content online should be free. But of course, this so-called free content being aggregated online by these search engines is most often the product of labor-intensive and very expensive newsrooms. Make no mistake, good reporting, especially investigative reporting, is expensive. It requires an investment of staff, overhead, sometimes a legal department, and it takes time and it takes expertise. As you probably know, international reporting is so expensive that many newspapers have closed their foreign bureaus altogether. The Baltimore Sun, for instance, no longer has foreign bureaus. The New York Times spends $3 million a year just to maintain its Baghdad office. The Times itself reported in a front-page story that fewer and fewer papers could afford to send reporters to stay on the campaign trail of the presidential primaries. The old boys on the bus paradigm is breaking down. In March, Jacques Steinberg reported that, quote, the price of admission, more than $2,000 for just one person to travel on Mr. Obama's charter flights that day, was too steep in an era in which newspapers in particular are slashing costs and paring staff with no end in sight. Well, maybe there's an end in sight now, but at the time, no end in sight to a primary campaign that began more than a year ago. Among the newspapers that decided they couldn't afford primary coverage on a regular basis, USA Today, the Boston Globe, the Dallas Morning News, the Houston Chronicle, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Baltimore Sun, the Miami Herald, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. So we're talking about major city dailies who could no longer afford to cover that primary. Incidentally, because I live in Chappaqua, New York, the national desk sent me to stake out the Clinton household last Tuesday in false anticipation of her conceding the race. About 24 journalists camped out on their street. We basically spent hours staring at these closed white gates, waiting for something to happen, filing really fascinating reports about they got a flower delivery or the Secret Service changed shifts. Hopefully the primary will all be over tomorrow. I think she's going to concede. Anyway, to get back to my point, covering and producing the news costs a lot of money, but online it's being offered for free. Now, there's a great deal of talk these days about citizen journalists who usually post their observation on blogs. The term citizen journalist is a loaded one, and it is usually linked with another phrase, gatekeepers. The theory is that traditional media, or gatekeepers, had a chokehold on public information and public discussion. Today, anyone who's willing to pony up about $8 a month for their own blog can have their say on all and have it distributed to a potential audience of millions. So no more do you need a plant or a printing press or a fleet of trucks to get the word out on your take on the issues of this day. Now, I have a blog myself, which Rob graciously alluded to, and I find a lot of blogs really enjoyable. But that said, one of my all-time favorite New Yorker cartoons shows one dog saying to another, I had my own blog for a while, but I decided to go back to just pointless, incessant barking. I love that one. So my point is that blogs often tend to blur the difference between opinion and journalism. And I'm not confident that local bloggers or so-called citizen journalists, which to my admittedly critical way of thinking are often writers without either journalistic training or editorial oversight, have the expertise, let alone the financial backing, or the access to uncover complicated, important national stories. I'm not even sure a local blogger, assuming that he or she has a full-time job, even has time to chase down how a local school board is spending its money. Even the high-profile bloggers, like the ones on Huffington Post and Online Venture, are not paid, and the vast majority of the stories that are posted on that site originate elsewhere. Now I'm going to take a moment to bite the hand that feeds me, because it has not been feeding me very well lately. It's not enough that ad dollars and readers are migrating to the web, and that the web is relying on the very news content that it's so busy undermining. The problem has also been compounded, at least at the New York Times, by some questionable management decisions. I've tried to give you the big picture, but here's a smaller picture, and one given from my own perspective as a regional reporter. Up until about 2 years ago, these Sunday regional sections that I told you about were independent of each other. There was a Connecticut section, a New Jersey section, a Long Island section, and a Westchester section. By the way, I'm from Westchester, so I always assume people know what it is, but it's a county about 30 minutes north of New York City. Each one of these sections had their own editor and their own deputy and their own copy staff. These local sections were highly profitable. They were very popular, first of all. They were profitable because they drew local advertising. They could target their ads to the local areas. But for the readers, people really looked to the section, of course, for their local news. And in my experience, readers can be pretty provincial, myself included. If you live in Connecticut, you might care passionately about what's going on in Iraq, but what's happening over in New Jersey state government is a little less compelling. So up until about 2 years ago, I had always written primarily for the Westchester section. I've been contributing news and feature stories for 18 years, and for 8 years had a column, alternately called County Lines, and for a brief and awkward time, simply called Kate Stone Lombardi. The column covered Westchester County, and it was a great deal of fun to write. I loved that column. I had a lot of freedom in choosing my topic, as long as it pertained to something going on in the county, and I had freedom in my writing style, too. The column didn't have to adhere quite so strictly to Times style, and I was even allowed, occasionally, to be funny and to use the first person. Somehow I even managed to fit a couple of articles about Williams in that space. How I made the Westchester connection, it was really kind of a reach, but I can share one of those with you later. And the alumni office was kind enough to make copies, which I appreciate. So anyway, a couple of years ago, the Times brass was looking for ways to save money, and they decided to consolidate the regional coverage. The task of engineering this reorganization fell to an editor who lived and worked in Manhattan. It was her belief that the suburbs were pretty much interchangeable, and that what was of interest to a reader in, say, Montclair, New Jersey, would also appeal to a reader in Hartford, Connecticut, or Scarsdale, New York, or Glen Cove, Long Island. So she jettisoned the individual sections in favor of one big regional section. It was actually called The Region. And she ran articles about lawn care and Lyme disease, the editor figuring from her perch on 43rd Street that this is what people who live outside of New York City are interested in. It was at that point that I lost my column for the first time. The woman who did the redesign got rid of a lot of long-term contributors and replaced them with 20-somethings to write about the suburbs. If there are any 20-somethings in here, I have nothing against you personally, but it was a rough time. Anyway, the redesign proved to be a disaster. Readers hated it. Letters poured in from people in Connecticut asking why they were reading about Long Island, and from New Jersey asking why they should be interested in Westchester's school budgets. Advertisers also hated it because it was no longer locally targeted. I'm happy to report that many readers also wrote in and asked what happened to my column. And those 20-somethings that had been hired to write turned out to be a little problematic. For starters, most of them lived in Brooklyn, and they didn't have cars, so they couldn't easily get to the areas that they were covering. They also had no experience or expertise, let alone contacts, in the area. So, after a decline in advertising and readership, management tried to undo some of the damage. Over the last year, they've done multiple redesigns, and they've tried to cobble back what they had before, breaking down the regional into local sections once again. I got rehired to write the column, and the young kids went back to Brooklyn. But they're trying to put out the old version, with a sharply reduced staff. And they're stuck trying to woo back once loyal readers and once loyal advertisers to a section that many of them had abandoned. After taking profitable sections, breaking them, and making them into money losers, My guess is that they will ultimately cut the regionals altogether. Their argument will be that they're losing money, and the institutional memory about the whole thing will probably be gone. In management's latest move, which was announced a few weeks ago to the newsroom, but actually not released to the press, so you're getting an inside scoop here, the Times quietly decided to close down all of their suburban bureaus, which produce stories for the daily paper. Those reporters were either bought out or reassigned. The only exception, they kept one reporter on to cover the entire state of New Jersey. So never mind that most of the Times readership actually lies outside of Manhattan. The 43rd Street view of the world is that people will not make their buying decisions about the paper based on coverage of the tri-state area. And they may well be right about that. That might not be the, make or break in terms of buying the paper. But there's also a tipping point, I think, when it comes to the value and the excellence of the paper. The columnist Molly Ivins, just before her death, observed that the newspaper company's solution to their problem was to, quote, make our product smaller and less helpful and less interesting. I think she makes a critical point. How much can you cut a newsroom without cutting quality? Across the board at the Times, things have been pretty grim lately. After instituting a hiring freeze last year, the paper then went through a round of buyouts. And many of the buyouts were essentially forced, with married couples being reassigned to separate bureaus and not so veiled threats that if the buyout wasn't taken, the job was going to be eliminated anyway. Even so, evidently enough people didn't take the buyouts, and there was another round of layoffs. They're also trying to cut back on freelance fees, which is why my column is again up in the air and may stay with a staff writer. Okay, now that I got my New York Times stuff off my chest, let's take a look at the future of print journalism. You won't be surprised to hear that I think it's pretty gloomy. It will be interesting to watch what Rupert Murdoch continues to do with the Wall Street Journal. I'll be interested to see whether the Sulzberger family continues to control the New York Times. But I really think that the bigger question is, as the newspaper business continues to constrict, and I think someone dubbed this talk the incredible shrinking newspaper, what implications is that going to have for democracy? I don't want to get too lofty here, but the premise of a democracy is an informed public. Gathering and disseminating news is an important social and political function. In the heyday of papers, long past, there was a sense of a kind of national conversation. Everyone was on the same page, so to speak. Now, with news sources so fragmented and news and opinion blending almost indiscriminately on the web, what's this going to mean for our society? You know how most of us just like to read the columnists with whom we agree or watch the cable pundits that cater to our own political bent? Well, what's the country going to be like when we're getting our news and opinion from websites where we feel comfortable and where people feel just the way we do? Meanwhile, other people will be visiting sites that are going to give them their own completely separate reality. And even more important, who will be left to do the kind of in-depth reporting that holds government and powerful institutions up to the light? Where will the resources be to support that kind of journalism? One possible solution is the public sector. Last year, Paul Steiger, the former editor of the Wall Street Journal, took over a nonprofit called ProPublica. This venture put together 24 journalists dedicated to reporting on abuses of power by anyone, government, business, the medical community, even the media itself. And they'll publish on the web, and the venture is being financed by philanthropists. The idea is that it can, in a modest way, make up for the lack of investigative reporting that is resulting from the collapse of newspapers. Interestingly, Craig Newmark, who is the Craig of Craigslist, has said he might invest in a project to support investigative journalism. Another solution was pitched in an opinion piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education. The writer, not surprisingly a retired journalist, suggested that the nation's wealthiest colleges and universities should set aside 3% of their endowments to buy the New York Times and ultimately to support other papers. I don't think that's very likely. But the writer argued that leading newspapers were as vital to education as libraries and classrooms and laboratories. I'm not sure how much like-minded philanthropy there is out there. And the idea of a government-sponsored press corps really sends chills up the spines of most Americans. I've heard varying dates for the year that the last print newspaper will land on someone's doorstep, but ink and paper are clearly not the future of journalism. That said, journalism schools are still swamped with applications from aspiring young people who want to enter the field. Williams is producing kids now, I have no doubt, who will be able to harness the internet in a way that preserves what's best about journalism and figure out how to make it work as a business model. I'm hoping that I can be in one of these audiences in a few years when one of them presents a talk called How the Web Saved Journalism and Turned a Profit Too. Thank you. Okay, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to read one column that pertains to Williams, and I'm reading this one because it pertains to reunions, so I thought it was relevant. This is a piece that I wrote about attending my dad's 60th reunion with him. My dinner partner to the left was almost completely deaf, and every few minutes opened with the same conversational gambit. I was in the Battle of the Bulge, but I can't talk about it, he kept shouting. The dinner partner on my right, mercifully, was my father, who spoke in lower tones and was not using the occasion to review his own similarly traumatic memories of World War II. There were, however, many other reminiscences. The event was my dad's 60th college reunion, and I was his date for the weekend. My father and I share an alma mater, Williams College, a small liberal arts school in New England known for its strong alumni devotion. He was in the class of 1946. I graduated 32 years later in 1978. It's a special bond to have, something we share outside of the family connection. Of course, I've attended my own reunions over the years too, as a newlywed for my 5th, pregnant for my 10th, with toddlers in tow for my 15th. When I celebrated my 25th, I left the teenagers at home, focusing instead on reconnecting with old friends, and especially taking pleasure in making new connections with people I hadn't spent much time with as a student. I can't imagine my dad having as much fun if he had come to my reunions, and come to think of it, they probably weren't too enjoyable for my husband, who I dragged along. But when my father first invited me to accompany him to his 50th, I was delighted. I see my dad frequently enough on family occasions, but rarely get him one-on-one. As an additional benefit, I earn bonus points from my mother, whose idea of a good time does not include traveling to the Berkshires to a college she didn't attend, talking to wives she insists are all named Buffy and Muffy and Kitty. She actually, I will interrupt to say, she said, gee, after you wrote that column, now I never have to go back. Anyway, this is actually not true, but I did meet men in my father's class who were referred to as Stinky, Chappie, and the Judge. Anyway, the 50th was a lot of fun, except that my dad insisted on introducing me to all his classmates as his trophy wife. Once we nipped that mortifying joke in the bud, the rest of the weekend proceeded smoothly. The class of 46 was an interesting one. My father arrived on campus in the summer of 1942 at the age of 17. He attended classes for only one semester before enlisting in the Army. Dad returned to Williamstown to resume his education in 1946 after the war ended. Many of his classmates also served, and some never made it back. My father actually graduated in 1949, but he and many of his classmates retained their original class identity with pride. My dad's 60th reunion reminded me that in some ways we attended the same school, in others a vastly different institution. We sang the same dopey football songs, lived in the same dormitories, enjoyed the same beautiful campus, and even overlapped on a few professors who started out as teachers in the 1940s and were nearing the end of their careers when I was in college. But the differences mark the changing times. Women didn't arrive at Williams until 1970. The student body in my father's day was male, nearly all white, largely Christian, and populated heavily by prep school boys. Having twice experienced today's college application scene with my own children, it shocked me to hear several of my dad's classmates explain how they got accepted at Williams. Quote, "My headmaster asked my father where he wanted me to go and then called the director of admissions to tell him I was coming." I was in the 4th freshman class that included women. By then there was a well-organized black student union, but few Latinos, and nobody was out as gay. A few years after graduation, some of our classmates would start dying of a mysterious virus that was not yet called AIDS. This year's reunion events included receptions for the bisexual, gay, lesbian, and transgender alumni network, as well as alumni of color, along with Shabbat services, and various other activities that mirror a little better what the country and the college look like today. At a reunion seminar on today's admissions picture at Williams, we were told that the incoming freshman class is roughly 28% Americans of color. An additional 8% are international students. But reunions are reunions, and they have their own familiar rhythms. At Williams, it is an annual meeting on Saturday morning, which mostly has to do with giving out trophies to the class agents who have raised the most money for the college. Classes are invited for a fifth reunion, and every 5 years after that are seated by age. Those past their 50th reunion, referred to as the old guard, are up front. Classes from the 1940s were surprisingly well represented. A fair share wore hearing aids and carried canes. There was some joking about how hard the repeated standing and sitting were on the knee and hip replacements. The 50th reunion class looked dapper in their 1956 straw boaters. Farther back in the auditorium, the 25th reunion class had only a scattering of gray hair and balding pates. Toward the back, the youngest reunion classes cradled babies and shushed toddlers. While a large contingent of the class of 2001 attended their 5th reunion, only a handful had woken up after a night of partying in time to attend the annual meeting, leading the college president to joke that their reunion gift should have been an alarm clock. Now here comes the part that Rob quoted. In a way, it was like sitting in the middle of a real-life actuary table, seeing the age you were and the people behind you and where you were heading up front. Looking over at my father that morning, I felt the time to be especially precious. The meeting ended with the alumni singing a college song that begins, the mountains, we greet them with a song." We both still remembered the words, and the mountains were the one thing at college that time hadn't changed. So.